You know how it is always trying to stay informed, cut through all the noise, right? Get the real story without spending ages wading through different articles.
Yeah, absolutely. Time is short.
Exactly. So that's what we're doing today. We're diving into something pretty bold coming from the Ruby on Rails world with their new release, Rails 8. They're calling it No-PaaS required.
Hmm.
Now, for anyone less familiar, PaaS is platform as a service. Think Heroku, things like that. Basically, you rent this managed environment for your web app, takes care of a lot of the server stuff for you.
Right, the headaches.
So this no-PaaS required idea, that's a pretty big claim.
Oh, it really is. It's a proper headline grabber. I mean, for years, these platforms have been the default almost for deploying apps, especially if you're a smaller team or solo developer.
Definitely.
So the idea that Rails 8 is aiming to seriously cut down or maybe even, get rid of that reliance, that's fascinating. It could really shift how many of us work.
Absolutely. And to see if Rails 8 can actually walk the talk here, we need to look under the hood, right? See
Yeah.
what's changed.
Yeah.
And the core of it seems to be what they're calling the solid trifecta. That's solid cache, solid queue, and solid cable.
Catchy names.
They are. But they're not just cool names, apparently. They represent a pretty fundamental shift in how Rails is handling those, essential background things. Caching, running background jobs, real-time stuff like WebSockets.
Exactly. Traditionally, if you wanted to speed up your site with caching, you'd almost automatically reach for something external, Redis, maybe memcached.
Right, the usual suspects.
Yeah. And for background jobs, you'd probably set up Sidekick or delayed job, something like that. Rails 8 is trying to bring these functions right into the application's own database. That's quite a departure.
And speaking of the database, we can't ignore SQLite in this picture. It sounds like Rails 8 is pushing SQLite as a genuinely viable option, even for production in some cases,
Hmm.
which kind of fuels this whole no-PaaS thing even more, right? Because you might not even need a separate database server process.
That's right. All ties together. And then the final piece is Kamal 2. It's a new deployment tool that came out alongside Rails 8.
Okay.
And this is all about making it simpler to actually deploy and manage your Rails apps yourself on basically any Linux server you want, putting you back in control of the infrastructure.
So our mission today really is to dig into these components. We want to figure out just how far Rails 8 actually goes in making this no-PaaS required promise a reality.
Yeah, what's the substance?
And maybe more importantly, what does it actually mean for you, the developer, trying to build and ship your projects efficiently? Okay, let's kick things off with solid cache. The big story here is caching without needing Redis, yeah.
Precisely. Solid Cache is it's a brand new cache store built into Rails 8. It's a direct alternative to those in-memory systems we just mentioned,
Oh.
Redis and memcached.
Okay.
The core difference, the really key thing, is that Solid Cache stores your cache data right in your application's database.
Which, my first thought is, isn't pulling data from a database slower than grabbing it from RAM? Much slower. Feels a bit counterintuitive for caching.
Yeah, that's a totally valid first reaction. On the surface, disk access is slower than RAM access, higher latency for sure.
Right.
But, and this is the interesting part, it's all about the trade-off. By using disk storage instead of RAM, you suddenly get access to vastly more storage space, and it's way, way cheaper.
Ah, okay. So the punchline isn't just database caching, it's the potential for massive caches, much bigger than you could affordably do with RAM.
Exactly. That's the game changer. The source material we looked at had this great example, 37 signals, the Basecamp and AHUI folks.
Yeah, big Rails users.
Right. They switched from Redis to Solid Cache.
Nah.
And get this, it let them scale their cache up to over 10 terabytes of data.
10 terabytes, wow.
Yeah. And the result, they saw a 50% reduction in their P95 render times. A huge performance win, basically because they could just cache so much more stuff. It wasn't just the hottest items anymore.
Okay, that really flips the script, doesn't it? So maybe an individual read might be a tiny bit slower from disk.
Potentially.
But because you can cache so much more, you end up hitting the cache way more often overall, leading to a faster experience for most users.
That's the key insight. You're trading a little bit of latency on a cache hit for a much higher cache hit rate.
Makes sense.
And it's worth mentioning, while SQLite is the kind of default database backend for Solid Cache in Rails 8,
Right.
you're not locked in.
Yeah.
You can still configure it to use other databases or even still use Redis, if that makes sense for your specific situation, maybe during a migration or something.
Okay, so there's flexibility. It's not forcing your hand.
Not at all.
But for you, the listener, especially if you're running, say, smaller apps or just trying to keep infrastructure costs and complexity down, This could be really appealing. Handling caching right in the database, less to manage, potentially lower bills.
Definitely a win for simplification.
Okay, let's move on to the next part of this solid trifecta. Solid queue. This tackles background jobs without needing Redis or separate systems like Sidekick, right?
That's absolutely right. Solid Queue is the new built-in ActiveJo backend for Rails 8. The whole idea is to give you a reliable way to run background tasks right out of the box
Okay.
without needing to set up and manage a separate queuing system. And crucially, without relying on Redis as the data store for those jobs.
So how does it work then? If it's not pushing jobs onto a Redis list, how does Solid Queue manage it all using just the database?
It's actually pretty straightforward conceptually. Solid Queue basically stores your background jobs as records right there in your application's database, like in a dedicated table.
Ah, okay, just database rows.
Exactly. And then it uses standard SQL features, inserting new job records, querying for jobs that are ready to run, marking them as processed, handling locking and retries, all using database capabilities.
That sounds surprisingly simple, almost elegant, using the database for what it's good at.
It kind of is, yeah.
Now, what about actually running the jobs? Do you still need separate worker processes like you would with Sidekey?
Well, that's where it gets quite flexible for, smaller setups, maybe a single server deployment.
Yeah.
Solid Queue can actually run embedded within your main Rails web process. For instance, there's a Puma plugin.
Oh, really? So no separate worker process needed at all?
For simpler cases, yeah. That's a huge simplification, right? You don't have to worry about managing those extra processes.
Wow, that is neat. That takes away a whole layer of operational stuff.
That's due. But, of course, if you have a larger application or really demanding background tasks, you absolutely still can configure and run dedicated worker processes just for Solid Queue. You scale it out like you would expect.
Okay, so it scales up if needed, but starts super simple. That embedded option sounds incredibly attractive for just getting a project off the ground or for smaller things.
Totally. And there was a quote from one of the Rails core team members that really captures the spirit here. They said the goal was to get to a point where you could basically install Rails, set up a database, and have background job processing right out of the box without having to manage 7 different gems and other systems.
Yeah, I felt that. Anyone who's set up Redis, Sidekick, got them talking, managed the workers, it can be a bit of a juggling act sometimes.
Exactly. That initial setup friction, Solid Queue really aims to smooth that over significantly.
Makes a lot of sense. Okay, let's round out the solid trifecta with Solid Cable. This one's about doing the real-time WebSocket stuff without Redis. How does that work?
Well, you might be sensing a theme here.
Uh-huh. The database.
A database, yeah. Just like Solid Cache and Solid Queue, Solid Cable uses the database as its foundation. In this case, it replaces the need for Redis specifically as the broadcasting mechanism for Action Cable.
Okay, so Action Cable is Rails' framework for WebSockets.
Right. And historically, if you wanted real-time features, think chat, live notifications, that sort of thing, using Action Cable,
You needed Redis.
you pretty much needed Redis to handle broadcasting the messages out to all the connected clients, especially if you had more than one application server instance running.
Gotcha. So with Solid Cable, those broadcast messages are now somehow managed through database interactions instead.
That's the core idea, yes.
Yeah.
It uses the database to coordinate and deliver those real-time messages. So again, for apps needing those real-time features, you potentially remove that dependency on having a separate Redis server just for Action Cable.
The pattern here is just crystal clear, isn't it? Rails 8 is making this really significant push to pull these common dependencies, especially Redis, back into the core framework, backed by the database.
Exactly right. And the combined effect of Solid Cache, Solid Queue, and Solid Cable, it's actually quite profound when you think about the infrastructure implications.
Yeah.
It really opens up the possibility of building and running a pretty wide range of web apps with a much, much simpler setup. For smaller, maybe medium-sized apps, the idea of running everything, web requests, caching, background jobs, real-time updates potentially on just a single host with just one database.
That's really compelling.
It's very compelling from a complexity and cost standpoint.
It paints this picture of a much more self-contained Rails application. Okay, let's step back for a second and think bigger picture. Why is reducing this reliance on Redis specifically such a big deal? What are the broader implications here?
Well, we've touched on it, but one of the biggest benefits is just simplifying your infrastructure.
Yeah.
Fewer moving parts.
Right.
That almost always means simpler deployments, less system administration overhead, Every extra service you add Redis, a message queue, whatever, it's another thing that can break, another thing to monitor, to scale, to patch.
Makes perfect sense. Less complexity usually means fewer surprises, fewer late-night pager duty alerts, hopefully.
Exactly. And another point that came up in the research is this common pain point, drift between your development setup and your production setup.
Ah, yeah, the works on my machine problem.
Right. You might not be running a full Redis cluster locally during development, right? So sometimes you hit weird issues only when you deploy. By having these core things built into Rails, using database backends by default,
You're more likely to have the same setup everywhere.
much more likely, which should minimize those nasty deployment surprises.
And we can't forget cost savings, surely. Running fewer servers or maybe fewer managed add-ons on a PaaS, that adds up.
Absolutely. Database storage generally is quite a bit cheaper than equivalent amounts of RAM for something like Redis, especially at scale. Consolidating these functions onto the database can definitely impact your hosting bill in a positive way.
Okay. But it's important to stress, right? Rails isn't forcing everyone off Redis.
Oh, absolutely not. That's crucial. The sources really emphasize this. These new solid features are the new defaults, making the simple path simpler. But you still have total flexibility. If you've got an existing app heavily using Redis, or if your specific use case needs the absolute lowest latency of in-memory, you can absolutely keep using Redis or Memcached or whatever other services make sense.
So it's about providing a good default path, but keeping the escape hatches open.
Exactly. It provides a smoother on-ramp for new apps and a flexible migration path for existing ones.
That makes sense. Okay, let's pivot slightly. We mentioned SQLite earlier. You said it's becoming more viable for production with Rails 8. That's traditionally been a big no-no for anything beyond tiny hobby projects. What's changed?
Well, there's been significant work done by the Rails core team, specifically on improving the SQLite adapter within Rails itself, making it more robust, handle concurrency better.
Okay.
And that's combined with SQLite itself getting better and better over the years. It's a remarkably solid piece of software. So the combination means it's becoming a much more compelling option for certain kinds of production use cases. Maybe not massive high-write, high-concurrency applications.
Sure, not for everything.
But for many, many applications, especially those that are more read-heavy or have moderate traffic, it's looking increasingly feasible.
And the biggest win, I assume, is just the sheer simplicity. No separate database server process to manage.
That's exactly it. That's the killer feature for SQLite in production. Your database is literally just a file, right there on the same server as your application.
Wow.
You completely eliminate the need to install, configure, manage backups for, pay for, monitor a separate PostgreSQL or MySQL server process. It drastically simplifies the whole deployment stack.
So you could potentially deploy a Rails 8 app, maybe using the embedded solid queue, solid cache on SQLite. And that's it, just the app code. No separate database instance.
Potentially, yes. For a certain class of application, that becomes a reality. It's incredibly streamlined.
That massively lowers the barrier to getting something live, doesn't it?
It really does. Especially for new projects, side projects, internal tools, and, as the articles point out, if your app does eventually outgrow SQLite's capability.
And you can migrate later.
You can migrate to Postgres or MySQL down the road. It's not a dead end. It's just a much gentler on-ramp to getting into production.
Yeah, it fits perfectly with this whole less infrastructure, more self-contained theme. Okay, final piece of the puzzle. Kamal 2, the deployment tool.
Yeah.
This is supposed to make getting these simpler Rails 8 apps actually onto a server easier. Tell us about Kamal.
Right. So Kamal 2 is pitched as an orchestration tool. It's specifically designed to make deploying Rails apps, particularly containerized ones, onto basically any Linux server much more straightforward.
Okay, containerized means Docker, usually.
Yep. It heavily leverages Docker.
Yeah.
The idea is you package your Rails app and all its dependencies into a Docker container image.
Right.
And Kamal then automates the process of getting that image built, pushed to a registry, or directly to the server, pulling it down onto your server, and then running it. It handles starting, stopping, updating the containers.
So it does the kind of deployment orchestration that a PS would normally handle for you.
That's the goal, exactly. It automates a lot of that heavy lifting, setting up the server initially to run Docker, managing deployments, handling things like environment variables, database setup tasks, trying to give you a PaaS-like experience, but on infrastructure, you fully control.
The documentation mentions really simple commands like Kamal setup to get started and then just Kamal deploy for updates. That sounds incredibly easy.
That's the promise for sure. The idea is after that initial setup, Pushing out new versions of your app should become a very simple, repeatable process, often just that one command. It also aims for zero downtime deployments, which is nice.
Okay. Now, one of the articles we read did inject a note of caution here. They said while the deployments themselves were smooth after setup,
Uh-huh.
getting through that initial Kamal setup phase could actually be a bit frustrating or challenging for some people.
Yeah, and that's a really important dose of realism. Kamal aims to simplify the ongoing deployment workflow, which is great. But that initial
You
configuration,
still need some work.
it might still involve a learning curve, yeah.
Yeah.
Especially if you're not already pretty comfortable with Docker concepts, maybe some basic server admin, SSH keys, things like that. It's not quite as, completely hands-off as pushing to Heroku right out of the gate. There's still some setup involved.
Right. You're trading some upfront configuration effort for more control and potentially lower long-term cost compared to a palace.
That's the trade-off in a nutshell.
So bringing it all together then, we've got the solid trifecta potentially removing the need for Redis. We've got SQLite looking more viable for production, simplifying the database layer. And we've got Kamal aiming to streamline deployment to your own servers. Does Rails 8 actually achieve this no palace required goal? Is the palace dead for Rails developers?
Well, based on the perspectives we reviewed, particularly the author who tried using Kamal for a hobby project,
Hmm.
the conclusion seems to be maybe no-PaaS is needed as often is more accurate.
Okay, a slight tempering of the headline.
Yeah. Their experience was insightful. Deployments with Kamal were smooth after setup, but that setup had its hurdles. And they still had some questions about how easily that setup would scale up later on.
Right. And their conclusion, I think, was that platforms like Heroku still offer real value, right? Especially for certain types of users.
Definitely. For solo developers, maybe really small teams, people who just want to focus entirely on the application code and not think about infrastructure at all.
The convenience factor.
Exactly. The pure convenience of a fully managed PaaS where the platform handles scaling, databases, security, all that underlying stuff. That appeal isn't going away completely.
Got it.
They also acknowledge that as your team grows, as your application gets more complex, maybe as your hosting bills on the PaaS start to climb,
Yeah.
the cost effectiveness and the control you get from self-hosting with tools like Kamal, combined with these new integrated features in Rails 8, that starts to look very attractive.
So it shifts the calculation.
It definitely shifts the calculation. I think the key takeaway is that Rails 8 significantly lowers the barrier to self-hosting. It bridges a lot of the gap between the simplicity of a PaaS and the power cost benefits of running your own servers. But it doesn't eliminate the gap entirely. It's not a one-size-fits-all replacement for PaaS, probably.
Okay, that sounds like a balanced view. So let's try and wrap this up for the listener. What are the main takeaways from this deep dive into Rails 8 and the no-PaaS required idea?
Okay, first big thing, a solid trifecta cache queue cable. These bring really essential web app functions right into Rails core, backed by the database.
Meaning less need for external services like Redis?
Exactly. And that leads to the second point. You get these more lightweight defaults. It's easier to get an application launched quickly with fewer external dependencies to manage right from the start.
Makes sense. And then there's Kamal.
Right. For those who do choose to self-host, maybe on a VPS, Kamal 2 looks like a really valuable tool to simplify that deployment process, trying to give you some of that PaaS-like ease of use on your own infrastructure.
Gotcha. So overall conclusion.
Overall, while no PaaS required might be, a bit strong as a blanket statement,
Marketing hype?
maybe a little bit, but Rails 8 undeniably makes choosing to run on your own VPS instead of a PaaS a much easier and more practical decision than it was before without forcing you to give up as much developer convenience. It offers a new, really compelling balance point.
It really does sound like a significant shift in how you can approach building and deploying with Rails, giving you more options, more control if you want it, without necessarily adding a ton of complexity thanks to these integrated tools.
Exactly.
So for you listening, as you think about your next project or maybe evolving your current apps, it's worth considering. Think about your specific needs, your team size, how comfortable you are with managing infrastructure versus paying for convenience.
Yeah.
How might these new Rails 8 features, the solid stuff, SQLite, Kamal, how might they change your workflow, your deployment strategy, your costs?
And maybe the final thought to leave people with is, how might these advancements actually reshape the whole web hosting landscape over time? As self-hosting gets easier, does that change the trade-offs developers make between Page's convenience and self-managed control?
Interesting question. Definitely something to mull over. We'd encourage everyone to check out these new solid features, Maybe give Kamal a try on a small project and see how it feels for your own workflow.
Sounds like a plan. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.